Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, The Power of Registered Investments, Unlocking Sustainable Funding for Organizations Just Like Yours. My name is Bill Petruk, and I'm delighted to be your host again, this one for our fifth webinar of 2025. Our first webinar was really focused on marketing and communications and the role that marketing and communicating with your donors plays in terms of informing, educating, and empowering them to be making good decisions for themselves, their families, as well as for organizations like yours. The second webinar focused on the importance of migrating your donors from good annual donors to mid-level donors to major gift donors to also the ideal transformational gift donor. And we had tremendous insights that were provided regarding that as we kind of started to look at the naming opportunities and the role naming opportunities play when you start to migrate your donors from annual donors and stewarding those relationships onto the augmented reality metaverse of iShare. Last month's presentation was on planned giving, and today's presentation is on another aspect of things that can be incorporated as bequests, but also incorporated as current gifts, and those are registered gifts. So as many of you know, the landscape of charitable giving is evolving rapidly. As you know, donating for ways to have greater impact, and charities are looking for new strategies to ensure that their missions are sustainable, that they thrive not only today, but for years to come. And one of the most powerful tools at our disposal and very rarely used is the use of registered investments, such as gifts of securities and other financial assets. The RSPs and the RIFs are very large. They're very powerful, and governments love them because governments have helped create that registered investment for many, many reasons. But one of the ways that we're going to explore today is how the registered investments get utilized for the benefit of charitable giving. So we want to look at how can we be giving more from registered investments, and how can we be incorporating something that your donors really like to hear about are smart, tax-efficient ways of giving from these important assets. So let's start off with a little bit of a primer. Primer in terms of what is a registered investment? What kind of registered investments are there? Well, the ones that we're most familiar with is the RRSP, the Registered Retirement Savings Plan, something that was envisioned in 1957 by the government and looked at as a very important retirement savings tool for Canadians. And then the RIF, the Registered Retirement Income Plan. And we'll spend a little bit of time just covering off these two asset categories. The Registered Retirement Savings Plan, interestingly enough, in 1999 was $421 billion. In 2022, 23 years later, it's grown 3.5 times to be $1.5 trillion. So let's stop here for a second and let's look at this chart. What's really interesting about it is, one, how large it is at 1.5 trillion. Two, the fact is that these represent people's savings, retirement savings. But three is that of that 1.5 trillion, half of it is taxable. So this is where our conversation starts to move into how can you, in your conversations with your donors, be looking at incorporating registered discussions with your donors around their charitable giving. So we start to look at what are the key features of the RRSP. One, it's a tax-deferred savings plan. That was the original intent. How people can be putting a portion of their earned income each year towards their retirement. These contributions on an annual basis, as you know, if you're a financial advisor or you're a person who has been contributing to their registered investment, are tax deductible. So they reduce your taxable income. And one of the things that we look at is at some point when you do withdraw your registered retirement savings plan, you will be taxed upon that withdrawal, whether it is as an RSP or as a RIF. So right now in 2023, this is the latest statistics that we have from Stats, that just under 10% of Canadians, 3.8 million, contributed to their RRSP. So that still represents a significant number of people that are putting money away for their retirement. And at some point, that number becomes a registered retirement income plan or an income fund that converts from the RRSP at 71 and a half years. So it's interesting. I was having a conversation with one of our clients, and they had a donor who was interested in making a contribution. The contribution was going to be in the form of shares, and the donation was going to be somewhere in the vicinity of between $25,000 and $50,000. Not a small donation whatsoever, but this donor, when we started to explore the other aspects of his life, such as he was a self-employed individual, he's been doing his own investments, but along the lines of, but he's always had an investment advisor. He's also had an accountant and a lawyer that he's worked with. But one of the things that he made mention was that he was going to be turning 71 next year, and that he has an RSP, not realizing that that RSP that was going to become a RIF might become a donation vehicle for him. And one of the things that we found really interesting was that he had approximately $500,000 locked away in his registered investment. And when asked the question of that RSP that's going to become a RIF, how much are you going to require in your lifetime? And his answer was, I don't know. I just know that I'm going to get taxed on half of it. And so if we start to look at, I've been contributing to my RSP, but I kind of stopped contributing to it, and it just kind of began to grow. But now I'm going to be converting it into a RIF, and that RIF is now going to be taxed, fully taxed upon my withdrawals. And it was presented that he could think about potentially working with his wealth advisor and working with his accountant and the charity to actually realize that he might be able to make a donation from the registered investment for that project. Well, the interesting part there was that between that 25 and 50,000, he was thinking about making a donation of appreciated shares. This became a revelation for him. And he says, I really don't think I'm going to need my registered investment. So I'm thinking that maybe this might be an opportunity, instead of getting taxed at the full extent on the $500,000, I can actually, you're actually telling me that I can actually make a donation. So what are the steps that are going to be required to be achieving that? And that's what we're going to cover off today. Because when we start to look at the RSP and RIF, one, the RSP is used for retirement savings. And as we look at it's tax deferral until withdrawal. The RRIF, there's a mandatory withdrawal, and it's fully taxable upon that withdrawal. But here are the giving options that exist for both. One, the RSP can be written into the will as a bequest, so a designated beneficiary. Or two, it could be withdrawn and made as a gift. And again, we're going to explain a little bit more about the mechanics around that as we go through it. With the RIF, we're starting to look at the mandatory withdrawal that takes place. the full taxability on the withdrawal amount and how much tax is payable. And then third is gifting in a will, donation from the withdrawal, and looking at not necessarily having to die to make the gift, but also how can that be fulfilled and achieved while the person is alive. So we start to look at, these types of options. It's quite simple. And this is a really interesting way to sit down with donors and actually have them understand some of the options that are available to them around making something positive happen with their registered investments. Now, the other statistic that is very interesting, and this is a 2022 statistic from BMO, is that the average RSP asset size was just over $112,000. So we're going to use 112, 120,000, 125,000 as kind of our baseline for examples of what we're going to be trying to illustrate for you that you can take away and have in conversations with your donors. So turning a registered investment into legacy gifts. Remember that this is the most taxed asset upon death. By naming or as the redemption is taking place, but by naming the charity as a beneficiary, or looking at how in the lifetime of the donor they can be looking at donating so that they can be offsetting these taxes. And what is that going to entail? What are the steps that are going to be required? And this is where the entire professional advisory team comes together and works with you and the charities, or the advisors work with their clients to help offset these taxes, and by illustrating the benefits associated by beneficiary designation or by direct giving. So in some cases, if the charities do this correctly, they will see the benefit that can be far greater than the heirs in some cases will receive, even though the heirs will be receiving the assets from other types of vehicles. And so what we're looking at is how can these assets be sectioned off so that the individual can be looking at making gifts today as well as in the future. So here's an example of an individual, and their RSP, the registered investment, is $112,000, the average. And if they were looking at something like a 30% of this number, what is that going to look like? If they took 30% of that donation of that RSP, what is that going to look like? If they did 30% of $112,295, that's $33,688. Probably more than they've ever given to a charity in their entire lives. Now, they haven't given away the full $112,000, but they've given $33,000. It reduces their tax from $55,260 on the 112 down to $38,682. Now, the heirs are just on the registered portion are going to get $57,000 if they didn't make a donation. But if they did make the donation, it would be $39,924. So we're starting to look at this is a subset of their overall assets. It's not their entire assets. It's last month we talked about the registered investments, and we started to look at what would happen if they left a specific amount, like $50,000. What would happen if they left a percentage, like 10%? Or what happens if they looked at the tax zero scenario? So if you want to go back and take a look at that presentation, it's available on the Funding Matters YouTube channel. But this one is really just focusing on the registered investments. So just look at the impact of starting a fund, making a charitable contribution of $33,000. Now, this is taking into consideration that this individual is probably not requiring that full $112,000. But the reality is they're not going to get the full $112,000 because they're going to be taxed on half of it. So when we start to look at the different ways to give, one of the ways that we touch on is naming the charity as a beneficiary. So having your organization or setting up a fund that allows that individual to create that beneficiary designation from their registered investment is a great starting point. Because you start to look at the other assets that the person may have. They may be looking at their stocks and their mutual funds and their unregistered investments as something that they may be requiring to access for other things. They may be looking at what they want to be leaving to their families. They may be looking at what they want to be including in their own lifestyles. But when we're starting to look at the registered investments, the simplest thing that they can do is name you as a beneficiary. The second is how can they be looking at their registered investments as withdrawals during their lifetime? And this is one of the things that we kind of want to play around with. That first example that I showed you is one simple way, and that's 30%. That's a big number, actually, for a person to be giving that away. But when you put it into context of what portion of that is taxable, then it changes their way of looking and what they want to do with the money that earned and grown with their advisors over the years. And then the third option, as we know, is a bequest through will. So we start to look at the beneficiary designation for the charity, the registered investment withdrawals, and that might be something that is strategically developed between the advisors and the individual and organizations like yourselves. So if you're giving from a registered investment, again, we're going to use that same example, have the province of Ontario, have the value of $112,295. Instead of 30%, we've got 25%. So we're going to look at 25%. What happens to this? Well, if they remember the tax was going to be $55,000 and the heirs are going to be left with $57,000. So if there's no bequest, okay? So we're starting to look at, here's a scenario, a taxable bequest of 25% leaves you with $28,074. The tax with a charitable bequest now reduces from $55,000 down to $41,000. And then the heirs in this scenario are going to get $42,776 as opposed to $57,035. So what we're really trying to show is the affordability of actually thinking about using, instead of the money going to CRA, Receiver General, how can that money be directed now towards the benefit of your organization or the fund for that donor and their family? So we have a real life, example here. John, he's 74. He's got $125,000 in his RIF income. One of the things that John has is that John's got a pension. John worked at a university or a college or worked at the government, has a built-in indexed pension. He's got other income coming in from other streams. And John is looking at the $125,000 in his RIF, and he sees the withdrawals that have been taking place over the last several years and the tax that he's been paying on that. And he was approached by the local hospital to give consideration to making a donation. And so when you start to look at his scenario here, we're going to jump and look at John with his $125,000, which is a little bit above the national average. But looking at that RSP RIF, and if they were to consider donating 20% of that, 20% of $125,000 is $25,000. John's tax immediately drops from 61 down to 49. But more importantly, the heirs with no bequest receive 63 versus 50. But more importantly, what John has been able to actually look at doing is taking a portion of something that is highly taxable and actually looking at doing good with it in terms of directing that to the benefit of the hospital. And so we've been able to do is satisfy what the hospital was trying to do with John in building the relationship around his giving. Secondly, is that John has been able to actually achieve something that he wanted to do, and he was able to do that in concert with his advisors and in concert with the ability to actually make this in a tax efficient way. So one of the things that John did was John, with the hospital, created a donation agreement. The donor agreement was for the $25,000. John, with his advisor, indicated that this $25,000 donation would be coming out of his registered investment. The advisor indicated that there was sufficient funding in the fund, as he has 125,000. And with the accountant and the advisor, they completed a T1213 form, along with a donation agreement between John and the hospital. And they were able to upload that T1213 form to CRA. So as you can see, it's not just a straight transactional deal. It's a deal that actually has, the John and his advisors working together to actually take a look at what might be an ideal situation, but with the approval of CRA. So once the T1213 is uploaded to the CRA site, then it takes several weeks, maybe a couple of months sometimes, for the CRA to actually review and then provide their approval of this donation. So it's not something that happens instantly. It does take time, and it does depend on who at the CRA that you're working with and you're dealing with and receives the upload of T1213 with all the other documents. So that in itself is a bit of an exercise in patience by the charity, by the donor, and in working with the advisors. So this is something that we have seen, work successfully. And in one instance, we actually saw that the CRA rejected it. And the organization and the accountant and the advisor tried to understand from CRA why they rejected it. It was because the person at the CRA who was actually reviewing the submission wasn't familiar with the T1213 registered investment donation process and rejected it. But when the organization went back and actually asked for a second opinion, the second opinion was positive. So again, this is an exercise that each and every time requires very much the same steps. So we looked at John 20%. We looked at another situation with 25%. And we looked at a situation with 20%. So we went, 30%. We went 30, 25, 20. But when we start to look at the size of the registered investment market, it's gargantuan. It's made up of the Johns, and it's made up of a number of individuals that add up to $1.5 trillion. We saw how that market of registered investments grew from 400 billion to now to 1.5 trillion. And so there is an untapped potential for each and every one of you to be looking at what might be an easy introductory solution for many of your advisors, many of your clients, many of your donors to start thinking about. And it's something as simple as 1%. It's not like if I asked every Canadian for a loonie that we would end up with $43 million. Everyone would have to participate. But if we look at this is a market that is locked in. Every Canadian who has a registered investment half of that investment is going to be taxed. So if we just looked at people starting to think of 1% of that overall number of 1.5 trillion to be donated to charity, even on that 1%, half of that's going to be taxable. So what kind of we can have a tremendous impact. And whoever misses a percent, like if you had $100, but you gave away and you went to Metro or you went to Loblaws and they asked you for a loonie to be used towards a food bank or for a kid's camp or whatever it would be, that loonie is 1% of $100. You'll never miss that 1%. And if you look at the fluctuations in the markets, if the market goes up 1% or 2% or 4%, which would be a great day on the stock markets, or it goes down 1% or 4%, if it goes up 4% or down 4%, you kind of miss it. But if it goes up 1%, you're not really noticing it that much. But we're looking at, investment advisors generating rates of return on average of about 6%. But if it was 1% of that money, of which half of it's taxable, we're looking at what kind of a solution, what kind of an outcome could we have if people were just looking at their registered investments of $1.5 trillion. If that was an opportunity to have that discussion, if 1% of 1.5 trillion, that would result every year in $15 billion being generated. Now, I know this sounds like pie in the sky, but it's a starting point that you're not asking people for 30% or 25% or 20%. You're just positioning something that can be a 1% solution. And it doesn't have to happen immediately, but it's an idea that be incorporated. So if we take the 1% of the 125,000 that John had, well, that would be $1,250. John would never miss that 1,250, and we know that half of it is taxable. So the fact is that the tax would be reduced. The heirs aren't going to be missing it that much. But if we went into a multi-year commitment for this type of giving, this can be factored in very nicely, not only into the annual giving strategy, the mid-level giving strategy, the major gift strategy, and the planned giving strategy. This is a very nice, elegant way to actually be incorporating a thought around a person gives you $1,200, they're a major donor to your organization. If they do that over 5 years, that's almost $7,000 that they're giving you. So just think of it in that sense. 1% of 125. How about 1% of 125 million? Now that becomes a very significant number that results in $1.25 million being given, bequeathed, transferred one way or the other. But it's also involving the advisors. It's involving the donors. It's providing the charities with a means to be looking at new strategies to ensure that their missions exist for years to come. And this becomes a bit of, you start to think about all the individuals in your organization and how many of those individuals have registered investments, either RSPs or RIFs. How about a 1% on 1.25 billion? Well, that's 250 million. But now we're not just looking at your organization, we're looking at right across the country. What are the numbers that if we start to look at just 1% of that, and how can that be illustrated to get people to start thinking with their advisors about how to make these types of donations? So how much is donated in Canada each year? Because let's start looking at that number of 1% as it relates to how much. $11.4 billion is donated in Canada each year. If we use the 1.5 trillion with 1%, of which half of that again is taxable, 1% of that amount of money, if that were donated, is $15 billion. More money than is donated from all the transformational gifts, all the major gifts, all the annual gifts, all the mid-level gifts, all the estate gifts combined. So here is a way to start thinking about something that is a very powerful giving tool, and that is the Registered Retirement Savings Plan, or the Registered Retirement Income Fund. So when we start to look at that, we've included the typical gift agreement. What would that look like? How would that come together? How would we be, putting, the agreements between yourself and your donor together? And then we have the T1213, and that is easily accessible from CRA. And who's the donor? What is information about them? What are the information that needs to be provided by their accountant, by their financial advisor, and how all that comes together. So what can you do today? Start the conversation. Introduce the concept of registered giving. You don't have to use the 1% solution, but the 1% solution is a guide. And it's a way that, Giftabulator has developed, different donor scenarios, but you can develop your own donor scenarios. And so we'd love to see how you can be utilizing this for the benefit of your donors and your organizations and your clients in moving forward. So I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time to take part in today's session. I hope you found something that's helpful, that could be beneficial, that you can be taking with you today to be reaching out to your donors. And next month's session on June 17th is going to be focusing on the power of endowments. How do we get to those endowments, and how do those endowments play an important role in the ongoing support of your missions and the desires of your donors to become far more philanthropic than they are in terms of strategic giving versus just general giving. So thank you again. I really found this exciting for us and our team to be actually putting this presentation together, because we kind of came up with a bit of a eureka moment with this 1%. I know it's a little bit out there in terms of approach, but I'd really like to get some of your feedback on that. So we're going to be sharing with a short survey. Please take the time to complete it. If you have any further questions, by all means, feel free to contact us. Follow us on YouTube. You can actually watch the videos after this and see for yourself. And if there's anything else that you'd like to see covered as a topic, please, by all means, contact us and tell us what you think. So have a great day and happy fundraising.